And then in 1911, Hadassah was formed. This was a woman's Zionist organization. This was, of course, before the founding of Israel. And this was to support improved health care in Palestine. 1922, first bat mitzvah. Before that, no women received a bat mitzvah. It was just young men receiving bar mitzvahs. Judith Kaplan, daughter of Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan, was the first woman. I received my bat mitzvah when I was 48 years old. And this audience were there. So, never too late. 1938, the first female rabbi. She was not ordained. She took over after her husband passed away. Her name was Tehillah Lichtenstein. 1972, Sally Priesand was the first ordained woman rabbi in the Reform tradition. Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum is voted one of the Newsweek top 50 rabbis in America over a 5-year period of 2007 to 2011. She is an openly gay rabbi, and she is the rabbi for the largest gay religious congregation, which is located in New York City. She's a very strong advocate for gay rights. 2009, Rabbi Alyssa Stanton, the first black female rabbi. And amazingly enough, 2010, one Orthodox woman has the title Rabbah, which is the female version of rabbi. Somehow or other, she slipped in there. She was ordained by Rabbi Avi Weiss. There are a number of Orthodox Jews who would say, no way, but there is one female rabbi in Orthodox Judaism, and there she is, Sarah Hurwitz. And to finish up, I think, in my opinion, women's roles in Judaism today take on a questioning of tradition, but along with an honoring of tradition at the same time, and a balance between the two. Thank you very much.
Our third speaker is Dr. Joretta Marshall, Professor of Pastoral Theology and Pastoral Care and Counseling at Texas Christian University. She holds a Master's in Divinity and an MA and a PhD from Vanderbilt University. She has written widely, books, essays, journal articles in areas such as forgiveness and abuse, Jewish and Christian reflections, pastoral care with congregations in social stress, communal dimensions of forgiveness, and pedagogy and pastoral theology in dialogue with lesbian, bisexual, and gay concerns. Thank you for being here.
Good afternoon. I'm glad to see this kind of conference and this kind of conversation happening in many places, because one of the gifts, I think, and Dr. Sahlin pointed this out, is that we are diverse and different. Even in our singular traditions, we are very diverse and different. There is not a Christian tradition. There are many Christian traditions. Everything from multiple kinds of Baptists to Pentecostals to fundamentalists to mainline Protestants to Roman Catholics to progressive liberals to post-Christian, postmodern. So we have many traditions. I'm going to cover the waterfront in 15 minutes, and I have because I come from a little bit more progressive postmodern, I want to say a word about who I am, because my journey represents a kind of generation of women who moved into leadership in particularly Protestant mainline denominations. I'm a product of the 50s and 60s. You could guess the age. When I was in the 5th grade, I grew up in a small town of 100 people, which is very small. Southern Wisconsin, which meant there was one church. It happened to be Methodist. And if you were Lutheran, you went 3 miles the other side of that community to go to another church. And if you were Roman Catholic, you went 3 miles the other way to go to another church, or else you didn't go at all. My mother, of course, was my Sunday school teacher most of the time growing up. When I was in the 5th grade, our teacher asked us to draw a picture of what we wanted to be when we grew up. They probably do this in 3rd grade now, but It was 5th grade. And I had no idea because I was a farmer and a farmer's daughter. So I started watching the boy next to me, whom I thought was actually quite bright, and I kind of wondered what he was drawing. And he was drawing a picture of people and somebody standing up front. And I thought I was drawing a minister, and he was actually drawing a politician. There is some connection in the midst of that. So I went home in 5th grade and said to my mother in this small town of 100 people, I think I want to be a minister when I grow up. My mother is a very wise woman without a high school graduation degree. She didn't say, oh, women don't do that, because at that point they really didn't do that very much. She just said, oh. And in a small church, one gets to do leadership because there's only 2 or 3 of you. And so I began to do leadership. Finally, when I went to college, which was a United Methodist school in Northwest Iowa, someone said to me, do you know that it says in the Bible, women ought to keep silent? Now, this bothered me for about, I would like to say 10 minutes, but it was really about a year. Because the Bible takes on all kinds of meanings for all kinds of traditions, and in my family and heritage, it was pretty important. But it was already too late, and God had already planted the seed, or I had invited God to plant the seed or something. So it was already too late, and so I don't keep silent very well. I went on to seminary and was among the first group of persons who were ordained by the first woman bishop in the United Methodist Church, who happened to be a woman by the name of Marjorie Matthews, who did much like one of the stories you reported. Her husband died, she went to seminary, became the pastor, and became the first woman bishop, actually a 3rd career woman, and I was ordained as one of her first classes. Now, against all of this, one has to think theologically. Think about the theologies that undergird the way in which we think about traditions. So against the backdrop of women and gender, men, gender issues in Christian traditions, you have to think about this little being called God, whom we normally refer to in most Christian traditions traditionally as Father, Son, Holy Spirit, one being, 3 beings. One being with 3 parts. It comes out in many different ways in many different theologies, but God is most often referred to in traditional theology as a father, or a creator, or, if you get to some of us who are a bit more feminist, we'll say mother, which disturbs some congregations. So we might say mother, Redeemer, Sustainer, instead of Father, Son, and Spirit. The Son, Jesus Christ, is always male. The Spirit is oftentimes referred to as she by some. So you might have God, Creator, Jesus Christ, the Redeemer, which still has a problematic in that it's a male deliverer sent by a father who ends up being crucified. And then you have the Spirit kind of floating around, which oftentimes is given almost the personification of, in some ways, the Shekinah, the kind of feminist part, the feminine part of God, and sometimes the feminist part of God, too, I suppose. In Roman Catholic traditions, there's another woman who enters that mix, Mary, who plays a very significant role, particularly in Roman Catholic traditions, but also in some other kinds of traditions that are closer to Roman Catholic. Interestingly, the biblical stories, some of which you mentioned, but there's also some in the New Testament of women, are women of leadership, and oftentimes we pick up those stories. They're also unnamed women, so you will hear about the woman at the well, the woman who was bleeding, the woman who this, as if they have no names, and in that culture and time that may have been the appropriate way to tell the story. But many of us who are feminists claim those women as part of our heritage. The church is often referred to as she, which again is an interesting gender piece in the midst of our theology. And fortunately you have Dr. Sahlin here who's going to unpack everything I've said in the next 6 months. Right? I want to talk just for a moment about particular practices and the way in which gender shows up in some of those practices. In some parts of our tradition, which I would say are the more conserving to conservative, conserving meaning we want to hold on to something, to conservative meaning we are holding on to something, you'll find very clear gender roles, much like your traditional definition or explanation. Women oftentimes are seen as the relational connectors, the ones who are to take care of children, the ones who give birth to children, of course, the ones who are to care for family, not always seen as public voices or as persons who can move into leadership in churches. In more traditional churches and more conserving traditions, you'll find women having a clearer sense, or at least, let me say it differently, the church has a clearer sense of what women ought to do. In more progressive, mainline, particularly Protestant, and even some Pentecostal traditions, you'll find women taking on leadership in incredible ways. So there's a real disparity, a real difference, a real divergence, and in actuality a really wonderful diversity among the way in which gender is understood in various traditions. For the most part, in almost all of the traditions in Christianity, women could always be missionaries, particularly if they were teachers or attached to men. So you'll find the mission movements of lots of denominations, including Roman Catholic, Episcopalian, Pentecostal, Baptist, mainline Protestant, with lots of women who are involved in missions, particularly as teachers, sometimes single women, sometimes married women who go with their spouses, who oftentimes are the missionaries, and they join them. But in my own denomination and in many other denominations, lots of the backbone of mission work, particularly in the kind of big mission eras, which were not always very helpful, but they were huge mission moments, you'll find lots of women in the mix. In Roman Catholic traditions, of course, women religious and male religious have particular places. Male religious become priests or part of an order, like they might become Benedictine or a member of some other kind of order. Women religious oftentimes became nuns or were identified in the before this era, although there are still some who wear habits. Have you seen women still wearing habits? The traditional dress for women religious. In both instances, women and men had particular roles. Women could not lead in the Eucharist, for example, the holy celebrations of the church. Some of that is breaking open just a little bit because some of the ways in which the culture moves relates to the market. And at the moment, there are fewer priests and more women. There are fewer nuns, but more women who want to take leadership. So it's becoming, even in the Roman Catholic tradition, there are some ways in which the context is changing our understandings. In some of the more Pentecostal traditions, women were clearly elders and leaders and preachers and sermonizers, leaders in the community.